Hello everyone, Lauren from A Girl and Her Wool here. Welcome back to my channel. Here on my channel I talk about things all behind the scenes of running a hand-dyed yarn shop, also a crafty themed, whatever it is shop. We're still figuring that all out. But happy to have you here today. This is part of the March into Spring Knit Along Saga series that we're doing here on the channel. So at the beginning of the month, I'm going to be kicking off what theme we're going to be talking about in the next month. Of course, you can mix and match the themes how you want, but I'm kind of picking one and going with that. So in April, we knit up variegated yarns. I'll be posting a wrap-up vlog of that soon, but if you want to hear the intro to that, I'll leave a link to it down below, along with the March into Spring knit along details. It's never too late to join in on this. Definitely feel free to hop in and out. It's going on all spring long, so April, May, and June. And yeah, so last month we kind of focused on variegated yarns, and this month we'll be talking about speckled yarns. So the overall feel of the knit along is to work with different yarns that have different dye techniques. You don't have to be a dyer. You don't even have to really care about the different dye techniques, but just kind of pick one and think about it as you work on it. So the March into Spring knit along came with a box if you chose to do it, but again, you don't have to if you don't want to. But the speckled colorway was this, which is called Snapdragon. A really pretty kind of minty green base with just all different kind of speckles on it. And the inspiration for this from the mood board was really around the cupcakes. The cupcakes themselves had rainbow speckles on them, and I kind of just used speckles from the rest of the mood board. But if you want to hear more about how I dyed this and actually watch me dye it, I will leave a link to that vlog down below and you can join me there. But I'm really excited to see how this one in particular knits up. Again, you don't have to use Snapdragon. You can use other Girl and Her Wool yarn. You can even use non-A Girl and Her Wool yarn, something speckled if that's the theme you want to go with this month. So I will be doing that. I guess I'll talk more about what I'll be doing kind of towards the end of this vlog, but I'm first going to talk about speckled yarns in general. So that is Snapdragon. So I wanted to run through some things to think about when you're working with speckled yarn. I know it's kind of a popular trend that's been around for quite a few years at this point, and it's nice to see how speckled yarns knit up, but I think that speckled yarns are often, or the speckles in yarns are often accents or to play with texture a little bit and not necessarily always the main color, meaning that when you knit up with them, maybe it's not the central focus of the yarn. And I think that will be the case here with Snapdragon. I think the main color is kind of that blue-green, and then you'll just get pops of little colors along the way. Again, everything I'm kind of talking about is my opinion and experience. Of course, there are going to be skeins where the speckles are the main part of the skein, and I actually have points about that to talk about. But I think in general, dyers will dye main color, whether it's one or multiple, and then kind of just speckle on top to add a little bit of extra pizzazz to it. And so it's interesting to see how this will differ from something like the variegated yarn that had a lot of colors in it, and kind of speckle a little bit as they knit up, but weren't dyed with speckles. So it'll be a fun comparison this month to do with the variegated yarns from last month. So one thing that I talk about in my dye with me, so again, if you're not interested in dyeing itself, it's just, again, something to think about while you're knitting or you're purchasing yarn and things like that. But let's kind of look at this skein a little bit as an example. So you can kind of see, let me find a good spot for what I want to talk about. Here's my first point. So when you look at the skein, right, when I had it kind of wound up, right, so I shouldn't have taken it apart quite yet, but when you have it wound up, you really see that there's a lot of speckles, right? You get you can tell there's a lot of speckles going on in there. But something to think about is if you zoom in on what you're looking at and you really kind of look at the skein, again, this is mostly going to be a blue-green skein that just has some speckles along the way. And if you take the yarn apart even further and just look at the one strand you're going to be knitting with at a time, and I focus on this, I think you can see it, but that's a spot that was kind of heavily speckled, right? But when you knit with that, it's gonna barely show in your knitting. If you look at that lone speckle on the top there, like this one right here, that's barely gonna show in your skein, right? In your knitting. Like if it goes to the front, you might see it, but in the overall thing, am I gonna notice that little speckle, that little pixel? Probably not. And so it's something to just think about. That's kind of where I distinguish speckled yarns from variegated yarns, is when you have a variegated yarn, like Tulips, which I'm finishing up my socks on, that had kind of longer strands of the color versus a speckle. And let me pull it out, tilt the blue. If you look at like this blue here, there's just more in a row, like that will definitely be a full stitch, versus that one speckle on here, which is still mostly green, and then a little speckle of blue. So that's just like one thing to think about, is when you're picking patterns with variegated yarns, you'll get those colors to kind of show up over a few stitches, whereas one speckle all by itself really won't show too much. And that's why I always talk about with dyeing with speckles is you're probably not overdoing it. Like when I dyed this up, I speckled so much. It looked like you wouldn't see the blue-green at all. But then again, when you take the strands apart, you know, it really separates it. And the one little dye powder particle really just kind of makes one little thing. So wanted to just kind of lay that out as like the base for what we're going to be talking about here. Again, think about it that way. And again, just kind of like how I view these things. So here again, this looks like a very heavily speckled part, but when you look at each strand individually, there's just not a lot there. Okay. So what does that mean for picking out patterns if you want to do that? What does that mean for your vanilla socks if you want to do that? What does it mean for your shawl if you want to put it in there? There's going to be two different ways we're going to think about this. So one is we have something like this that is overall a tonal color that will have speckles on it, which will kind of just be little pops of color, meaning that I would almost view this pretty similar to a tonal color. And I think you can go a little bit more adventurous with the pattern you want to pick than maybe we would have with a variegated yarn, because again, it's going to be mostly tonal. The every speckle every once in a while will not distract from, let's say, cables or lace as much as a variegated yarn would. Of course, the speckles will hide the pattern a little bit more than the tonals will, but in something like this, I think you can get away with doing something a little bit more interesting or complicated, complex than with the variegated yarn. But you know, that's kind of what swatching is for as well too. So yeah, I think something like this will kind of just add to the pattern a little bit more. So if you do something that's a little bit lacy, maybe it just adds a little speckle every once in a while, but overall you still see that lacy pattern. So in terms of the amount of speckling, that's kind of what I'm kind of getting out here. So if you have like a mostly tonal color that has some speckling across the board, you can probably do a little bit more. You can get more complicated with it the more kind of tonal the base is. Whereas if maybe the base is a variegated skein with some speckling on top, then yeah, kind of steer away from the complex patterns because it might hide it too much. And with that being said, one way again to kind of tell is to unwind the skein. Of course, if you're shopping online, you might not be able to, but maybe the dyer is willing to do that and take a picture for you, or you know, you kind of just get used to seeing it. So again, you see a lot of the blue-green in this colorway. It looks like there's a lot of speckles, but you can see a lot of the blue-green, the base color. So just something to kind of look out for when you're doing that. I think the second thing to look out for when it comes to looking at speckled yarn is what do the speckles themselves look like, right? So I'm talking a lot about the tonal and the amount of speckles, but what about the speckles themselves? You could have a colorway that maybe is more of a plain base that has one speckle on top. So maybe it's like something, you know, like this, or maybe it's like, yeah, maybe it's something like this, and then it just speckled darker blues and greens to just kind of highlight the blue green on it. To me, that's more of a uniform color. Again, that's where you can kind of treat it like a tonal. Or you can have something that maybe is like a white base that just has rainbow speckles across the board. And that's really what the colorway was about, was the rainbow speckles. Something where you have all of the colors across the rainbow, I think is something that would end up distracting from a pattern than more so something that's more uniform. So that's something to think about too. I think if it's a uniform look, even if they're speckles, you can kind of treat it like that tonal. And then if you have a colorway that has colors just across the board, maybe you treat it more like, you know, a simpler pattern, like a variegated yarn. In this one, I view these more uniform. So yes, there's some yellow, there's some purple, there's some blue, and there's some pink, but those are all kind of related. They all kind of jumble together kind of nicely. You're not getting every color across the rainbow. So again, I think this is one where we can get away with a bit more of a pattern. So yeah, I think those are the things to think about when picking out a pattern if you want to do it. Of course, vanilla is always a great option. It'll be so much fun to see all of the speckled yarns knit up into vanilla socks, but of course, it's fun to talk about what it would look like in texture. And all of the textured patterns that can also be applied to sweaters, or I guess ponchos, sweaters, shawls, things like that. If you're doing a kind of garter stitch shawl, you'll get a different look than if you're doing something with lace and cables, and that's something to think about with these speckled yarns too. Okay, so for recommendations on patterns, I think everything that I talked about in the variegated yarns would work for this one as well. So we kept it pretty simple with the pattern recommendations for the variegated yarns. So of course those are gonna work with these too. So Hermione's Everyday Socks, we talked about the Artist Garden socks, I think they were, the Tiff Nealon design that you can kind of like mix and match different colors and marl them and see what it looks like. Speckled yarns, you can do that with it too. Everything we talked about last week, you could definitely apply this week. And other people sent in pattern recommendations too. So definitely check out the recap vlog where I kind of recap recommendations other people made as well. So we can talk about that there. So for some new ones, the ones I kind of was looking for were ones where maybe there was a little bit more texture, but not anything too intricate or too over the board, but just ones where I thought maybe having a little bit of speckling would add a little bit more interest. So I actually made Hohi's 2-colored socks with one of my colors, Love at First Sight, and Pebbles in the River. Again, it's a 2-colored sock pattern, so of course you can use the contrast tonal. So if you have the March into Spring box, the contrast tonal was Azaleas, which is this tonal pink. So I will be, when I get to what I'm going to be doing, I will be using this as the heel, cuff, and toe. But you could do that with like Hohi's 2-colored socks. Maybe you didn't use the contrast for another skein and you'll have extra. That's one where it has a little bit of lace on top, but it also has the striping, and I don't think that speckles would take away from the striping. And then it also has a lot of a little texture and a lot of just stockinette. So I think that's where across the different patterns it'll be fun to see the speckling. And then Summer Lee has some really great sock patterns. So some that I picked out were Mermaid Avenue and the Stillwater socks, but honestly I would just go through the catalog and pick some out there. Again, these are ones that had a like kind of a uniform pattern across the whole socks. They were a little bit more than maybe just knits and purls, but kind of added some fun in there. There's the intersection socks by Marceline Smith. These had a little bit of cabling, but again, it's really just pretty simple, and I think the speckles will make it just a little bit more of a pop. And then the Linnea socks by Susanna Winter. Those are, again, some texture, but nothing too, nothing that the speckles will take away from. Of course, obviously vanilla socks are a great option, and I have the same YouTube recommendations as last time that you can check out channels to learn all the techniques and everything like that. That will be linked down below that we talked about last time. And yeah, the same designers too. So Lisa K. Ross, Helen Stewart, and Summer Lee, again, have great patterns that you could definitely use speckled yarns in if you want something that's not vanilla. All right, so what am I doing? So again, I will be using Snapdragon from the March into Spring box and Azalea, which was the contrast tonal. I did use it as my contrast for my variegated yarns, variegated socks. So I will be doing this. I will be doing a pattern this month. I did not for the variegated yarn. I did a vanilla sock. So I'm going to do a pattern for this one. And I decided I'm going to be doing the intersections pattern. It looks like one. It's just some cables, but they're kind of like bigger cables. So it's not like a tiny cable going down. They're just kind of like ripples almost. And I think it'll be really a good Zen pattern. You'll probably really get into the habit with it, and then, or like get into a good rhythm with it. And then the speckles will just add a little bit more, because even though there are cables going down it, it almost looks like a stockinette vanilla sock, and I think the speckles will look nice. So definitely feel free to join in on that, or pick another pattern, or do vanilla socks. So that is it. Definitely leave recommendations or what you're going to be doing down below. Don't forget to check out the details for the knit along. You definitely will be entered to win prizes if you follow along. And I will be talking the results of the variegated, not the results, but you know, recap the variegated socks later this week. And then later this month we'll do something similar with the speckled yarns. So yeah, can't wait to see how it goes. Have a lot of fun with this, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.